Section 6 of A Popular History of France, Volume 4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Popular History of France from the Earliest Times by François Guizot, translated by Robert Black. Chapter 28. Francis I and Charles V, Part 6. Scarcely had Francis I ascended the throne on the 12th of January, 1515, when he made the Duke of Bourbon's great position still greater, by creating him Constable of France. Was it solely to attach to himself the greatest lord and one of the most distinguished soldiers of the kingdom, or had, perhaps, as has already been hinted, the favour of the Queen Mother something to do with the Duke's speedy elevation? The whole history of Charles of Bourbon tends to a belief that the feelings of Louise of Savoy towards him, her love or her hate, had great influence upon the decisive incidents of his life. However that may be, the young constable, from the moment of entering upon his office, fully justified the king's choice. He it was who, during the first campaign in Italy, examined in person, with the shepherd who had pointed it out, an unknown passage across the Alps, and, on the 13th and 14th of September, he contributed greatly to the victory of Melegnano. "I can assure you," wrote Francis I to his mother the regent, "that my brother the constable and M. de St. Pol splintered as many lances as any gentleman of the company whosoever, and I speak of this as one who saw. They spared themselves as little as if they had been wild boars at bay." On returning to France, the king appointed the constable governor of conquered Milaness, and to give him a further mark of favour, he granted him the noble privilege of founding trades in all the towns of the kingdom. This, when the Parliament enregistered the king's letters of patent, was expressly stated to be in consideration of Bourbon's extraordinary worth, combined with his quality as a prince of the blood, and not because of his office of constable. The constable showed that he was as capable of governing as of conquering. He foiled all Emperor Maximilian's attempts to recover Milaness, and not receiving from the king money for the maintenance and pay of his troops, he himself advanced 100,000 livres, opened a loan account in his own name, raised an army working corps of 6,000 men to repair the fortifications of Milan, and obtained from the Swiss cantons permission to enlist 12,000 recruits amongst them. His exercise of authority over the Lombard population was sometimes harsh, but always judicious and efficient. Nevertheless, in the spring of 1516, 8 months after the victory of Melegnano, and 2 months after he had driven Emperor Maximilian from Milaness, the Duke of Bourbon was suddenly recalled, and Marshal de Lautrec was appointed governor in his place. When the constable arrived at Lyons, where the court then happened to be, the king, says Fleurange in his Memoirs, gave him marvellously good welcome, but kings are too ready to imagine that their gracious words suffice to hide or make up for their acts of real disfavour, and the Duke of Bourbon was too proud to delude himself. If he had any desire to do so, the way in which the king's government treated him soon revealed to him his real position. The advances he had made and the debts he had contracted for the service of the crown in Milaness, nay, his salary as constable and his personal pensions, were unpaid. Was this the effect of secret wrath on the part of the Queen Mother, hurt because he seemed to disdain her good graces, or an act arising maybe from the mistrust and maybe from carelessness on the king's part, or merely a result of the financial disorder into which the affairs of Francis I were always falling? These questions cannot be solved with certainty. Anyhow, the constable, though thus maltreated, did not cry out, but his royal patroness and mother-in-law, Anne of France, daughter of Louis XI, Dowager Duchess of the House of Bourbon, complained of these proceedings to the king's mother, and uttered the word ingratitude. The dispute between the two princesses grew rancorous. The king intervened to reconcile them. Speedy payment was promised of all that was due to the constable, but the promise was not kept. The constable did not consider it seemly to wait about, so he quitted the court and withdrew into his own duchy, to Moulins, not openly disgraced, but resolved to set himself, by his proud independence, above the reach of ill will, whether on the king's part or his mother's. Moulins was almost a kingly residence. "The dukes," said the Venetian traveller Andrew Navagiero, in 1528, "have built there fortress-wise a magnificent palace, with beautiful gardens, groves, fountains, and all the sumptuous appliances of a prince's dwelling. No sooner did the constable go to reside there than numbers of the nobility flocked thither around him. The feudal splendour of this abode was shortly afterwards enhanced by an auspicious domestic incident. In 1517 the Duchess of Bourbon was confined there of a son, a blessing for some time past unhoped for. The delighted constable determined to make of the child's baptism a great and striking event, and he begged the king to come and be godfather, with the Dowager Duchess of Bourbon as godmother. Francis I. consented, and repaired to Moulins with his mother and nearly all his court. The constable's magnificence astonished even the magnificent king. 500 gentlemen, all clad in velvet, and all wearing a chain of gold, going 3 times round the neck, were in habitual attendance upon the duke. The throng of the invited was so great that neither the castle of Moulins nor the town itself sufficed to lodge them. Tents had to be pitched in the public places, in the streets, in the park. Francis I. could not refrain from saying that a king of France would have much difficulty in making such a show. The queen mother did not hide her jealousy. Regal temper came into collision with feudal pride. Admiral Bonnivet, a vassal of the constable and a favourite of the king, was having built, hard by Châtellerault, a castle so vast and so magnificent, that he seemed, says Brantome, to be minded to ride the high horse over the house of M. de Bourbon, in such wise that it should appear only a nest beside his own. Francis I., during a royal promenade, took the constable one day to see the edifice the admiral was building, and asked him what he thought of it. "I think," said Bourbon, "that the cage is too big and too fine for the bird." "Ah!" said the king, "do you not speak with somewhat of envy?" "I!" cried the constable. "I feel envy of a gentleman whose ancestors thought themselves right happy to be squires to mine?" In their casual and familiar conversations the least pretext would lead to sharp words between the Duke of Bourbon and his kingly guest. The king was rallying him one day on the attachment he was suspected of having felt for a lady of the court. "Sir," said the constable, "what you have just said has no point for me, but a good deal for those who were not so forward as I was in the lady's good graces." At this period princes of the blood, when speaking to the king, said Monsieur; when they wrote to them, they called him Monseigneur. Francis I., to whom this scarcely veiled allusion referred, was content to reply, "Ah, my dear cousin, you fly out at everything, and you are mighty short-tempered." The nickname of short-tempered stuck to the constable from that day, and not without reason. With anybody but the king, the constable was a good deal more than short-tempered. The chancellor, Duprat, who happened to be at Moulins, and who had a wish to become possessed of 2 estates belonging to the constable, tried to worm himself into his good graces; but Bourbon gave him sternly to understand with what contempt he regarded him; and Duprat, who had hitherto been merely the instrument of Louise of Savoy's passions, so far as the duke was concerned, became henceforth his personal enemy, and did not wait long for an opportunity of making the full weight of his enmity felt. The king's visit to Moulins came to an end without any settlement of the debts due from the royal treasury to the constable. 3 years afterwards, in 1520, he appeared with not a whit the less significance at the Field of Cloth of Gold, where he was one of the 2 great lords chosen by Francis I. to accompany him at his interview with Henry VIII. But the constable had to put up with the disagreeableness of having for his associate upon that state occasion Admiral Bonnivet, whom he had but lately treated with so much hauteur, and his relations towards the court were by no means improved by the honour which the king conferred upon him in summoning him to his side that day. Henry VIII., who was struck by this vassal's haughty bearing and looks, said to Francis I., "If I had a subject like that in my kingdom, I would not leave his head very long on his shoulders." More serious causes of resentment came to aggravate a situation already so uncomfortable. The war, which had been a hatching ever since the imperial election at Frankfort, burst out in 1521 between Francis I. and Charles V. Francis raised 4 armies in order to face it on all his frontiers, in Guienne, in Burgundy, in Champagne, and in Picardy, where there was no army, says Du Bellay, however small. None of these great commands was given to the Duke of Bourbon, and when the king summoned him to the army of Picardy, whither he repaired in all haste with 6,000 foot and 300 men at arms raised in his own states, the command of the advance guard, which belonged to him by right of his constableship, was given to the Duke of Alençon, who had nothing to recommend him beyond the fact that he was the husband of Marguerite de Valois and brother-in-law of the king. Bourbon deeply resented this slight, and it was remarked that he frequently quoted with peculiar meaning a reply made by Gascon, gentleman to King Charles VII., who had asked him if anything could shake his fidelity. "Nothing, sir, nothing, not even an offer of 3 kingdoms as yours, but an affront might." The constable did not serve a whit the less valiantly and brilliantly in this campaign of Picardy. He surprised and carried the town of Hesdin, which was defended by a strong garrison; but after the victory he treated with a generosity which was not perhaps free from calculation the imperialist nobility shut up in the castle. He set all his prisoners at large, and paid particular attention to the Countess de Roux, of the house of Croy, whom he knew to have influence with Charles V. He was certainly not preparing just then to abandon the King of France and go over to the camp of the emperor; but he was sufficiently irritated against Francis I. to gladly seize an opportunity of making new friends on the rival side. Meanwhile, there occurred the event which was to decide his conduct and his destiny. His wife, Suzanne of Bourbon, died at Châtellerault in April, 1521, after having lost the son whose birth had been celebrated with such brilliancy at Moulins, and having confirmed by her will the settlement upon her husband of all her possessions, which had already been conferred upon him by their marriage contract. From whom came the first idea of the proposal to which this death was ere long to lead? Was it the Chancellor Duprat, who told the mother of Francis I. that the will and the settlement might be disputed at law, and that she would then enter into possession of a great part of what belonged to the House of Bourbon? Was it Louise of Savoy herself, who conceived the hope of satisfying at one and the same time her cupidity and the passion she felt for the constable, by having an offer made to him of her hand, with the retention secured to him of those great possessions which, otherwise, would be disputed, and which a decree of Parliament might take away from him? Between these two explanations of what occurred at that time there is no certain choice afforded by historical documents; but the more reasonable conviction is, that the passion of Louise of Savoy was the first and the decisive cause of the proposal made to the constable. He was then 30 years old; Louise of Savoy was 45, but she was still beautiful, attractive, and puissant. She had given the constable unmistakable proofs of her inclination for him, and of the influence which his inclinations exercised over her. She might well flatter herself that he would be attracted by the prospect of becoming the king's stepfather, and almost a sharer in the kingly power, whilst retaining that of the great feudal lord. The Chancellor Duprat, full of ability and servility, put all his knowledge, all his subtlety in argument, and all his influence in Parliament at the disposal of Madame Louise, who, as a nearer relative than the constable, claimed the possessions left by his wife, Suzanne of Bourbon. Francis I., in the name of the crown, and in respect of the constable's other possessions, joined his claims to those of his mother. Thus the lawsuit with which the duke was threatened affected him in every part of his fortune. It was vain that more or less direct overtures, on behalf of Madame Louise and of the king himself, were made to induce him to accept the bargain offered. His refusal was expressed and given with an open contempt that verged upon coarseness. "I will never," said he, "marry a woman devoid of modesty." The lawsuit was begun and prosecuted with all the hatred of a great lady treated with contempt, and with all the knowingness of an unscrupulous lawyer eager to serve, in point of fact, his patroness, and to demonstrate in point of law the thesis he had advanced. Francis I., volatile, reckless, and ever helpless as he was against the passions of his mother, who, whilst she adored, beguiled him, readily lent himself to the humiliation of a vassal who was almost his rival in puissance, and certainly was in glory. 3 lawyers of renown entered upon the struggle. Poyet maintained the pretensions of the queen mother; Lizet developed Duprat's argument in favor of the king's claims; Montthallon defended the constable. The Parliament granted several adjournments, and the question was in suspense for 11 months. At last, in August, 1523, the court interest was triumphant. Parliament, to get rid of direct responsibility, referred the parties, as to the basis of the question, to the King's Council, but it placed all the constable's possessions under sequestration, withdrawing the enjoyment of them wholly from him. A few years afterwards Poyet became chancellor, and Lizet premier president of Parliament. Worth alone, say the historians, carved out for Montthallon at a later period the road to office of the Keeper of the Seals. The constable's fall and ruin were complete. He, at an early stage, had a presentiment that such would be the issue of his lawsuit, and sought for safeguards away from France. The affair was causing great stir in Europe. Was it, however, Charles V. who made the overtures as the most efficient supporter the constable could have? Or was it the constable himself who, profiting by the relations he had established after the capture of Hesdin with the Croys, persons of influence with the emperor, made use of them for getting into direct communication with Charles V., and made offer of his services in exchange for protection against his own king and his own country? In such circumstances, and in the case of such men, the sources of crimes are always surrounded with obscurity. One is inclined to believe that Charles V., vigilant and active as he was, put out the first feelers. As soon as he heard that Bourbon was a widower, he gave instructions to Philibert Naturelli, his ambassador in France, who said, "Sir, you are now in a position to marry, and the emperor my master, who is very fond of you, has a sister touching whom I have orders to speak to you, if you will be pleased to hearken." It was to Charles V.'s eldest sister Eleanor, widow of Manuel the Fortunate, King of Portugal, that allusion was made. This overture led to nothing at the time, but the next year, in 1522, war was declared between Francis I. and Charles V. The rupture between Francis I. and the Duke of Bourbon took place, the Bourbon lawsuit was begun, and the Duke's mother-in-law, Anne of France, daughter of Louis XI., more concerned with the fate of her house than for that of her country, and feeling herself near her end, said one day to her son-in-law, "My son, reflect that the house of Bourbon made alliance with the house of Burgundy, and that during that alliance it always prospered. You see at the present moment what is the state of our affairs, and the lawsuit with which you are involved is proceeded with only for want of alliances. I do beg and command you to accept the emperor's alliance. Promise me to use thereto all the diligence you can, and I shall die more easy." She died on the 14th of November, 1522, bequeathing all her possessions to the constable, who was day by day more disposed to follow her counsels. In the summer of 1522, he had, through the agency of Adrien de Croy, Lord of Beaurain, entered into negotiations not only with Charles V., but also with Henry VIII., King of England, deploring the ill behaviour of Francis I. and the enormity of existing abuses, and proposing to set on foot in his own possessions a powerful movement for the reformation of the kingdom and the relief of the poor people, if the two sovereigns would send persons of trust and authority into the vicinity of his principality of Dombes, to Bourg-en-Bresse, whither he on his side would send his chancellor to come to an agreement with them and act in common. In the month of March, 1523, whilst the foreign negotiations thus commenced and the home process against the constable were pursuing a parallel course, Bourbon one day paid a visit to Queen Claude of France at the hour when she was dining alone. She was favourably disposed towards him, and would have liked to get him married to her sister Renee, who subsequently became Duchess of Ferrara. She made him sit down. Francis I., who was at dinner in an adjacent room, came in. Bourbon rose to take leave. "Nay, keep your seat," said the king. "And so it is true that you are going to be married?" "Not at all, sir." "Oh, but I know it. I am sure of it. I know of your dealings with the emperor. And bear well in mind what I have to say to you on the subject." "Sir, is this a threat, pray? I have not deserved such treatment." After dinner he departed and went back to his hotel, hard by the Louvre, and many gentlemen who happened to be at court accompanied him by way of escort. He was as yet a powerful vassal, who was considered to be unjustly persecuted. End of Section 6, read by Professor Heather and By. For more free audiobooks or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org.